Okay, so I'm going to talk about 4 or 5 things which coincided around January, February this year, or came to a head, crystallized. Coincided is a good word for it. And the result was suddenly I'd lost my stressful motivation, my worry. I was more present. I was more able to be in places and spaces doing things like dancing or enjoying time with friends, not thinking about work. I was able to unplug, and that's been a rare thing for me. I would be able to wake up feeling calm without any kind of stressful motivation to just get up and get going. In fact, the last 2 weeks of being here, I didn't do anything, pretty much. A few little things, a few little bits and bobs. But there was, I'm going to say 5 things. I'm going to list them, and I'm going to try and kind of piece together what the importance of them was. And obviously you've got to put these are 5 things which have probably sat on top of 10 or 15 years of self-development work, admittedly, 20 years of business experience, probably 10 or 15 years of searching, seeking, and time spent in the cave, time contemplating. But most recently it's on the back of action, real work, doing things that I've been enjoying and loving. And I'm going to describe what they were. So the first, in no particular order actually, was I'd been reading a book for a year called Freedom from the Human Condition by Jeremy Griffiths. And I'm not going to, it's a big book, but it's an important book. And it kind of, whether you kind of believe it, whether you resist its message or not, it's founded on scientific research. It's based on the fossil record, and it basically talks about the fact that love, we're actually indoctrinated. He uses the word indoctrinated into love. And that came about because our ancestors, our bonobo type ancestors, our ape ancestors, is shown to have, if you like, emerged and evolved through in a space, a safe space with limited competition but with an abundance of food, and which coincided at a point in our evolution where we were beginning to stand to walk upright, and which meant we could cradle our young for longer without we protect and cradle and move around and enjoy the fruits, and we could love them longer, nurture them longer, Now, so this process evolved over time. There's a lot more to it. I invite you to read the book. But what happened was, effectively, we evolved to expect to receive and give love. And then came along, through some miraculous, perhaps still relatively unexplained, although he does make great strides into explaining how consciousness as we kind of know it and experience it arrived. And at that point we suddenly had our conscious mind, which had a search for knowledge imperative, trying to understand why, ironically, whereas before we didn't have that. We were just perhaps more instinctually driven. But anyway, his argument and his findings suggest that the mind is not the savior of the instinct, our aggressive instincts, our competitive, competing for food instincts. It's that we move beyond that, we evolve beyond that requirement because of the environment within which we were born into and through. And then aggression was selected out of our gene pool. That doesn't mean we don't still have access to it, but it wasn't the best way to spread our genes. So, to cut this short, essentially we are instinctively wired to love and be loved, and to collaborate and cooperate and care and nurture. So, but the world we live in, the manufactured conscious search for knowledge, which is not criticized either in the book. It's just a part of our evolution, a necessary part of our evolution to arrive at the point of understanding what exactly is the human condition and why it arose, and therefore in that knowing we can let it go, is that we feel like we've still got to be competitive, survival of the fittest and whatnot, which actually is a misconstrued edit to the evolution of species. So for some reason Charles Darwin evolution of species, he didn't put survival of the fittest in there. He was encouraged to in the second edition, I think, by his colleagues, but it wasn't. He was I think deeply unhappy with that as a way of describing it, but that's taken on by the business world in particular and the corporate world, and it is reflected in the greed and the rape of the environment. Anyway, I'm going to leave that book for you, but the point is I read that book and I felt a massive relief about, I felt more aligned, because inherently one wants to love, and when one's more connected with oneself and has cleared away some of the crap that the let's call it the matrix world puts on us, or we attract, or we inherit, we're able to see more directly our more true heart of connection, and yet the world doesn't want us to. But after reading this book, for me, that was a release, and I was able to think, yeah, okay, good, I'm happy with that. Next was, I went through a process of local bar here, Guy's Bar, returning to using alcohol as more of a medicine. I gave up drinking for 10 years, and I've returned to it over the last 5, but generally a completely different relationship to it, a very light social part of my life, nothing major, and I'm happy to take it or leave it, actually. But I find myself spending in the darkness and of this club night, was thinking through certain things, and eventually, probably after 2 or 3 of these nights, arriving at a conclusion. And it was probably related to the book, and it was stop criticizing the mind, and that was a message to myself and a message to push out there. I felt my relationships with women, the world, and men, life, business, work, was always a criticism of the mind, like, oh, you're not embodied enough, you're not present enough, the mind is, get out of the mind is the problem. And but to some degree it's true, but what I found was, as soon as I reached this realization of this insight, stop criticizing the mind, I felt like I had a more solid grounding, somewhere where I could actually stop criticizing my mind and just let it do what it needs to do, and not get too tied up in it. So I just keep reminding myself that, and if I find somebody else is criticizing my mind, I'll remind them that that's not a very productive way of looking at things, or helpful for me, certainly. So what's your version of stop criticizing the mind? It may be different to mine, but that was mine. That's one thing. So we got this freedom, love. We're indoctrinated to love. We want to love, and we're expecting to be loved, and that's okay, because that's inherent. That's who we are. The other is stop criticizing the mind. The third was, I'd arrived at the why, the who, in particular the who, Transformerpreneurs, the what, the how, the when of what I wanted to do with my life and work, which encapsulated everything I want to do. So I had no struggle to need to go elsewhere. I'd arrived. It was like, oh wow, after 4 years at least of consciously being available to understanding it through writing my books, I was able to say, right, well, I've got those factors. There is nothing else I need to discover or find out. It's released so much energy, time, mental space, and pressure. Now it was just a matter of doing it, and that's what I'm doing now. I'm into that process. That was 3 things. The other thing, so that was about purpose and meaning, which I've talked about in another post, but this was really important because it was the culmination actually of probably about 20 years. I'd always felt that I wasn't on purpose, even though I'd created my businesses, even though I was creatively doing all of these things that I kind of wanted to do, and I made them, they become a cage. Whereas now, I feel like I've got a bigger picture mission and a small day-to-day, very personal mission within that too. So I cover the whole spectrum. And that was proactively seeking. It was trying things out, trying different things, and it was writing, contemplating, meditating, doing lots of inner work, and then eventually not doing any inner work and just carrying on working. And suddenly these things start to pop out and form into a holistic mission. And that's transformerpreneur.com, and it's evolving as we speak. And I'm hoping you're going to be a part of it because you're watching this. So that was the third, I think. The fourth was, and interesting enough, this might well be actually, I'm going to save this one till last. The fourth, let's say, was I had found my way. My work sometimes sees me bounce around a little bit into different things. I kind of in the flow of being called to do something almost in response to what some people are talking to me, which puts me on the right track. It's like listening to your client base. But I wasn't really that clear what my client base was at this time. But I started writing like an email course, just to bring it back down to earth a little bit more. An email course is part of my welcome pack for subscribing, and it was a Finance Made Easy. So it was just taking people through something which I felt they were missing in their education, and my community had been reporting that back to me as well. I'd tested it out by just talking to a few people. So I spent time doing that, and it was the most sluggishly painful process. Like the hardest thing sorry, that's a huge exaggeration, but I mean, it was the hardest thing for me to keep doing and keep working on. It was like wading through treacle for some reason or another. But anyway, a 10-word email course took me about 2 months to write, and I was doing very little else. And that came to the end of that during January towards February, which was, I suppose I talked about it in another post. It was like a creative process which I wasn't really happy with the result as I was going along, but gradually did at the end. So that was the fourth thing. The fifth thing was, come the end of January, I'd just left, or just been discharged from, so in Early February, discharged from a bankruptcy. And this was a bankruptcy that I'd had to go through a year or two ago, year ago, one more. And it was a result of problems I'd got into where in 2008, so over 10 years ago, I'd been funding our businesses with personal loans that you could get at the click of a mouse button back then, before the crash. Within minutes, hours, days, you could have 20, 40, 60, 70, 80,000 pounds. And I wasn't using it for personal, lifestyle things. It was fueling the business. It was dealing with cash flow pressures, and also it was dealing with problems that we weren't facing, which was that we were too big, we weren't generating enough revenue, we weren't profitable enough. All these kind of things, which on a big scale are real problems. So we were I was in particular, I was glossing over the dealing with the issues, but they came in bits. They came to a point where they were became very real. Our businesses had to liquidate. The following year, they had to liquidate again. I joke that in 1 year I was alone. I wasn't in a relationship, and I joked that I'd liquidated our businesses more times than I'd had sex. There was a silver lining at the end. We managed to raise some funding to relaunch a creative agency business, which has become very successful. I've since left to go live in a cave. But that debt was still there for me, and I serviced it as best I could along the way. I was on a debt management plan, which has certain restrictions, and then eventually I came to a point where, particularly as I was living in caves, not generating much income, writing books, the lifestyle and life of an author is not one of great wealth unless you are very good or very lucky, but you can be very good and also very unlucky. Not to say that I was very good per se, but just to say that it's not an easy route to wealth or money. So, and that wasn't my intention with the writing, but anyway, so I eventually decided to bankrupt. and regroup from there, which has now been gone through the process. So I suppose that was, even though it wasn't a conscious one, I wasn't that disrupted. I'm sure people are more disrupted when they go through it themselves. I'm pleased that there wasn't directly any personal people that were affected by my bankruptcy or the liquidations. Particularly, we tried to be very good in those processes back then. But there was obviously a release from that, knowing that everything I do now is under my control, as in if I create value, it's mine to guide and mine to direct. It doesn't need to be sort of retransferred and shifted back to paying the banks. It's a difficult subject to talk about perhaps sometimes because there's such a stigma attached to it, but there is a responsibility of the banks to make sure those kind of things don't happen. But I take my responsibility for doing it, and I've done a lot of work on my relationship with money, and in particular the knock-on effects of how to build and maintain a business that is true, is honest, is not a house of cards, let's say, which is why particularly I'm now focused on making sure that transformpreneurs can have a solid foundation to their business, so then we can get working together on the more exciting bits: marketing, product creation, experience creation, and all those different things which allow us to deploy the transformation craft into the world and make positive, lasting change at a global scale. And with many transformerpreneurs working together with that collective goal, I think we're probably unstoppable. So those were the 5 things. But interesting enough, I feel consciously that the bankruptcy thing is probably the least effect. I think the other things have the most power, probably in the order I described them. So there it is. If you can use that, hopefully you can, but there might be 2 or 3 things that you might only be 1 or 2 steps away from, 1 or 2 days away from, or weeks or months, that are only just around the corner, where suddenly that feeling of trying to search, trying to find an answer is revealed to you. I hope so. Thanks for listening.